China. And there are a lot of headlines on that front today. Probably foremost among them are some revelations from former Ambassador John Bolton's book, talking about his time in the Trump administration. He makes a lot of claims about what he witnessed there. All of this, as we learned that U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was meeting with China's top diplomat in Hawaii, although we don't know exactly what they were meeting about. Akiko Fujita is watching these developments for us. And it seems as though some of the revelations from the book might be relevant to perhaps even the talks that are going on.
Yeah, there's no question about it. It gives us some insight into how the administration, more importantly, how President Trump views the trade talks. Not surprisingly, John Bolton very critical of the way these talks were handled during his time there. And he calls it, saying the administration handled in a completely chaotic way from day one. He's talked about the fractured intellectual approach to this, saying essentially some of the key figures, whether it was Secretary Mnuchin or Robert Lighthizer, were constantly at odds because of the way they viewed China. Now, one of the more stunning revelations that come out of this points to a conversation that Bolton alleges President Trump and President Xi had in the lead up to that G20 summit in Osaka, Japan last year, where Bolton says the president essentially asked Xi to help him out with re-election by signing this trade deal. And here's specifically what he says in the book. Now, he says that President Trump told Xi a China trade deal would be a big plus for him politically. And then this excerpt from the book, Trump then stunningly turned the conversation to the coming U.S. presidential election, alluding to China's economic capability and pleading with Xi to ensure that he would win. He then goes on to say he stressed the importance of farmers and increased Chinese purchases of soybeans and wheat in the electoral outcome. Trump then raised the trade negotiations collapse the previous month, urging China to return to the positions it had retracted and conclude the most exciting, largest deal ever. So John Bolton there saying essentially President Trump asked Xi for a favor, knowing that any kind of China deal would give him a big political win that he could take into the presidential election this fall. President Trump has responded to these allegations, all of these allegations laid out in the book, in a tweet today, saying that it is a compilation of lies and made up of stories, all intended to make me look bad. Many of the ridiculous statements he attributes to me were never made, pure fiction.
Very quickly, though, how would the Chinese government respond to Akiko if they wanted to get into this kerfuffle? I mean, it would be official statements in Chinese newspapers, right?
I mean, they would be, but I can't imagine the Chinese would want to take part in this back and forth of a former administration official and the president. The Chinese are perfectly fine sitting back and watching this all play out, because that means more distractions away from the actual trade deal and other political issues that the U.S. has raised concerns about, whether it is about what they're doing in Hong Kong or what they're doing in Xinjiang. This is another distraction for the administration. And President Xi, as far as he's concerned, this allows him to move forward with his agenda.
But Akiko, what does any of this really, mean for President Trump? I mean, his base is already hardened. You can't get more hardened than not wearing a mask to stop a pandemic. So his base is set. What does this mean then, I guess, for his reelection hopes? Does it maybe preclude some kind of further action as far as maybe another impeachment hearing? What can we get out of this outside of headlines?
I mean, you'd have to look at all the allegations that are laid out in the book to say whether there is, in fact, a case for Democrats to bring forward. John Bolton seems to be nudging it in that direction, saying, if you think what happened with Ukraine is bad, there are certainly a lot of other allegations that he says you could point to in his book. Having said that, what does this all mean for the election? I mean, I have a hard time thinking that John Bolton's book is actually going to tip the election in one way or the other. If you thought the president was transactional, and that a lot of these deals that he's made throughout his administration were for personal gain, you probably still believe that. And if you thought that he was doing the best to move forward and make a fair deal with China, I'm not sure the excerpts in this book are really going to change your mind.
Right, especially maybe if Bolton had come out with this stuff quite a while ago. Akiko, I also want to ask you about some of the other fronts on which the China-U.S. tension is playing out, right? You have, for example, Eric Schmidt of Google talking about that he does think Huawei was sort of doing some spying of some kind. And then you also have the listings war, right? JD.com just listing in Hong Kong And that's just the latest Chinese company to have a listing in the US and in Hong Kong, which also seems to be a sign of the tensions.
Yeah, there's no question about that. Let's start with the issue as it relates to listings in Hong Kong, because JD.com, just the latest company, the second company in actually 2 weeks that have had a listing on the NASDAQ here in the US and gone for a secondary listing in Hong Kong. NetEase was the other one last week, and they've done quite well. This comes at a time where we, of course, have seen an increasing attention given to US listed Chinese companies and the call for increased scrutiny. Senate Republicans have pushed forward, or I should say it's a bipartisan bill, they have pushed forward a bill to increase accounting oversight on these companies that are listed here. At the same time, we heard President Trump several weeks ago talking about increasing scrutiny and the NASDAQ moving forward on that as well. There's a lot of Chinese companies that are looking to Hong Kong's listings as a potential a safe spot so that they've got two separate listings. And also Hong Kong has done a lot to try and attract these companies. Most recently, they allowed for these companies' secondary listings to be included in the Hang Seng Index. And an interesting note from Jefferies out a few weeks ago saying that in the best case scenario, 31 Chinese companies that are listed in the US right now could now seek a secondary listing in Hong Kong, and that could increase the weight of the Hang Seng Index in terms of those Chinese, US-listed Chinese companies to about 24% by 2021. So that's pretty significant movement on that front. Now, Julie, to the point, the other point that we're watching here, which is unrelated, Eric Schmidt making those comments in an interview with BBC Radio. The full interview is still set to be released tomorrow, but he alleges that Huawei has, in fact, spied on U.S. companies. Specifically, he says there's no question that Huawei has engaged in some practices that are not acceptable in national security. And then he says it was possible to think of the company as a means of signals intelligence, alluding to some spy agencies, saying there's no question that information from Huawei routers has ultimately ended up in hands that would appear to the state. Having said that, he didn't provide specifics, so it's hard to break down what specifically he was alluding to in that interview.
Yeah, but it is interesting to hear someone not in government make that kind of assertion. So we'll keep watching that one. Akiko, thank you so much for all of that wide-ranging information on China.
Hey investors, Zach Guzman here. Are you interested in learning more about the markets and getting the latest financial news? Well, then click right here to subscribe to our Yahoo Finance YouTube channel. Get the latest up-to-the-minute market analysis, big interviews in the world of finance, and information on how to manage your money every day wherever you are.